Good morning and welcome to our short program on the U.S. Senate. I'm Kevin Kosar. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'll be your host. Today we'll discuss the state of the chamber and how its functioning might be improved. The subject matter is particularly topical because we had an election earlier this week, and the Senate will have a new Republican majority. Additionally, the GOP will be choosing a new party and majority leader. Mitch McConnell, who has led the party since 2007, announced earlier this year that he would not continue as leader of the conference. Now, to help us with this conversation, I have with me two eminent scholars of the Senate. We have Anthony J. Madonna, a professor at the University of Georgia. He's the author of many scholarly articles on Congress, and most recently published a piece for Political Research Quarterly titled Interbranch Warfare, Senate Amending Process and Restrictive House Rules. If that's not evidence of his expertise, I don't know what is. We also have with us James Wallner, a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, who's worked in the Senate and is the author of 3 books on the chamber, the latest of which is The Death of Deliberation, Gridlock and the Politics of Effort in the United States Senate. I'll speak with Tony and James until about 9:30, and then we're going to take audience questions. And speaking of audience questions, you can submit them at any time. You can send them to jahun.lee, that's JAEHUN.LEE at aei.org, or you can post them on Twitter or X with the hashtag #AEI Senate. All right, let's get this ball rolling. Let's first talk about the state of the Senate. Today's Senate is not the same Senate we had 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. Like the House, it evolves. So let me start with you, Tony. How has the Senate changed in recent decades? What's working well down there? What's working not so well?
Thank you for having me, Kevin, and thank you so much for that introduction. You made that paper sound way more interesting than the paper probably would be to most people.
I think I might read it now.
Yeah, oh, exactly. It's you sold it. No, I also really appreciate this because all the negative attention we've seen towards the House, right, past couple years, you'd think that the Senate was some kind of like well-oiled machine. I've been on, I think, 2, 3 reform panels lately, all about the House. But I would argue that while they differ in a lot of ways, we're still looking at 2 pretty comparable legislative dumpster fires. Differing in some ways, but still similar in that sense. In terms of what's working well right now in the Senate, they're doing an adequate job confirming judges, I guess. I think Biden was on par with other presidents in terms of judicial nominees in year 3. Wasn't drastically outpacing anyone from what I had seen, but that's a bit surprising given nominations is what the 118th Senate has done. 542 roll calls, which isn't out of line in terms of what we've seen with Senate roll calls the last 30, 40 years, but 362 of them were either nominations or procedural votes on nominations, which is just right around exactly 2/3. That compares to about 12% of all Senate since 1970. In terms of like substantive votes, and this is the thing I've been talking about, Mike Lynch and I have a book that's coming out next year looking at the evolution of the roll call record in Congress, but just 10% of all roll calls this past Congress has been on amendments, which compares to about 50% of all Congresses since 1970. As Kevin and I have written, right, this has been tilting downward throughout the last couple of decades, largely as leadership has reacted to the rise in messaging amendments. Drop in amendment votes is certainly also impacted by the lack of substantive bills being considered. I think the low number of public laws in this Congress has been pretty well documented. But votes on actual substantive bills, basic passage votes, are also down to about 5% of the record, which is consistent with, I think, what you've seen the last couple of Congresses, but far fewer than the 14% average. And this isn't to say that any of these mechanisms or measures are panacea. The House is at 35%, but almost all of those votes are on bills that are destined for failure anyhow. They're pure messaging passage votes. Increase in cloture votes is pretty dramatic, also been pretty well documented. And broadly, what we've observed is that this decline in substantive votes has been pretty substantial throughout the 20th century, early 21st century. And we've seen them replaced by a pretty substantial increase in procedural measures in both chambers. And yeah, well, I think fewer messaging votes probably makes sense. We've probably moved a bit too far. And I think the biggest problem Congress has right now is with its complexity. If you want to get people interested in following the institution, I think the solution has to start with simplifying its processes. The toughest part of my job, every year I have to do this and you've probably been in this boat, where you have to explain legislative process to a very smart foreign journalist. And it's just like, why do you do it that way? Like,
I think that's every American's rite of passage, Tony. Explaining the procedure to a very intelligent foreign journalist. I think it's most people in Stand By Me. I think Stand By Me, the movie, was about that.
I would not be shocked. Yeah, punchline is, it is nightmarish. And yeah, this is a thing that's typically not something, like when I've talked to people interested in reforming either the House or the Senate, they want to hear. They want to hear you can just adopt a new rule or two new rules on top of the existing rules, right? And that's going to make things like better. But I think any solution needs to start with simplification, because right now it's just really difficult to get anybody interested in Congress. I'll also add, because this comes up all the time, I'll get asked by students, like, how do you fix Congress? Usually at the beginning of a semester. And my stock answer is, the best way to do it is you find the nearest campaign consultant and you punch them as hard as you can in the throat. And I think I'm joking. But if you look at a lot of the problems, I think right now with Congress, is so much of it stems from just fear of elections and fear of what these votes are going to do, even though we know 99.999% of all roll calls mean nothing, right, to the general public and have no real impact. But I think members are often being convinced that these things do matter, even though probably don't. Yeah, I have a bunch of additional reform ideas, but that's kind of where I would start. All right, I'm happily to throw it over to James here.
All right. Well, let's just to make sure I heard you correctly about, as we're talking about the condition of the Senate, and then I'm going to pivot to James to get his take on the condition of the Senate. So fewer votes on amendments, more votes on procedures,
and nominations.
Significant number of votes on nominations, which means fewer votes on legislation, because unless you're expanding the quantity of time available for these sorts of things, and that necessarily follows. When I talked to Professor Steve Smith over at, he's got positions at Arizona State University and Washington University in St. Louis a few weeks ago. He noted that there was also it was a plunge in the number of committee hearings and markups in addition. So throw that into the mix. James Wallner, longtime Senate watcher, studier, sometime participant. When you look at the condition of the Senate, how's it compared today versus a few decades ago, or way back during the days of Mike Mansfield? Wherever you want to start your baseline, it's your choice.
So in the beginning, there was this thing called the Agora. No. First off, thank you, Kevin, for hosting this, and thank you, AEI, for putting this on. I really regret that we're not there at your fabulous facilities in person, but I think it's important conversation to have, and I look forward to being there in the future. And thank you all to the viewers who are tuning in. I'm obsessed with the Senate. I don't know. I've been told I'm not allowed to talk about it all that much, and so I took up fly fishing, and then I got obsessed with that too, and now I'm obsessed with two things. And I guess, so maybe we can have a panel on fly fishing too, Kevin. That'd probably be pretty good. And then senators who fly fish. But no, I love this. And I wake up in the morning thinking about the Senate. I go to bed thinking about the Senate. I wish I played guitar. Maybe that would be a probably more sociable kind of interest, maybe, because people after a little bit get a little tired of talking about the Senate. And I think that gets to Tony's point. The question is, how do you get people interested in the Senate, and by extension, the House, and by extension, American self-government, civic life? And that's really important, because American self-government implies that we, the people, are governing ourselves, right? And so that means if we're not taking an interest, if we're not participating in that activity, either directly or indirectly through our elected representatives, then it's starting to break down. Something's not working. And I think what's not working is front and center when we look at the Senate today, right? The way you get people interested in the Senate, yeah, we can simplify it, but you got to raise the stakes. We talk about the Civil Rights Act of '64, this landmark legislation. I ask, how many people know about the Civil Rights Act of 1957? No one raises their hand. I had one student one time raise their hand, and it stole all my thunder. I was like, put that down. I'm making a point. Then I ask about the Civil Rights Act of 64, and everybody raises their hand. They may not know exactly what it is, but they've heard it. Somewhere, somehow, they've heard somebody say the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They know it's important. They may not know why, but they know it's important. Why is that? Well, it's not because we had foundations funding projects to promote this legislation and the great work that the Senate did on it, like we have with people trying to promote the Inflation Reduction Act as somehow people will love Congress if they just know what it's doing. And maybe they would. But Congress is a crucible of conflict, and people pay attention to it when they have things they want to do or when other people have things that they don't want to do. And then they fight over them in that place and in that time. And that then draws more people in because, everybody loves a dumpster fire. Everybody loves a fight. We have all these traffic because there's a wreck and everybody slows down. They want to see it. That stuff attracts attention, and that itself destabilizes everything. It makes our coalitions unstable. It makes it hard to control, and it makes it in like all kinds of things possible. The great thing about self-government when no one's in charge is that there are boundless possibilities. If you think about it, I have an idea, then you come in and we're about to agree. And then all of a sudden Tony shows up unhelpful and throws out something else and uses words like nightmarish. And I'm like, well, I'm interested now. Tell me more. And then all of a sudden what we had, that stability is gone. But out of that process where no one can control things, you get great things. You get things like the Civil Rights Act of 64. You get things like the Constitution. You get things like our kind of system of government. So the question is, how does all that relate to the Senate? And why does the Senate serve as Exhibit A in the fact that that whole idea of government isn't working? And it's quite frankly that the Senate, we see declines across the board in deliberation. We see declines in amendment votes. We see declines in votes. We see a rise in nomination votes, but that's not because they have to confirm more nominations. It's because the leaders are using those nominations to manage the floor, to keep senators around. So we're going to have a vote on Monday. We're going to have a vote on Tuesday right after lunch, maybe right before. We're going to have a vote on Thursday, guaranteed right after lunch. Because if we don't, everybody's going to leave and go home. So they use those votes to keep everybody around. Meanwhile, they try to do all the important work of the Senate, of the country, that the people send them to do behind closed doors in private conference rooms, because as Tony's research has demonstrated, they're afraid that if they do it out in the open, that they may make the wrong decision, that they may cast a vote that may come back to haunt them. And the reason they're afraid of that is because no one knows what's going on. We have this idea, this comfort that we're all polarized. There's a red America and a blue America. If you're a liberal, then you're set. You know how to vote. Well, no, you don't. If you did, you'd be voting. Right? When it comes to immigration, what's the right vote on immigration for someone like a Senator Roger Wicker? Think about that for a second. What's the right vote? He doesn't know. It depends on the issue at hand. It depends on then what somebody else comes in and offers an amendment, and then he's got to make another decision. And then the president may intervene down the road, and he may have cast the wrong vote. And all of this uncertainty swirling around, they want to get rid of that. So even senators who may not like what's happening, they will disenfranchise themselves if what they get in return is certainty, so they can go work out in the gym and know the vote's not going to be called. They can get a light workload, so they're not going to be up till 4 a.m. like they were during the appropriation season when I first started in the Senate. It was miserable, but that's the way you do things, right? And so they get certainty, they get a light workload, so it's more enjoyable experience. And then they also get safety. Safety from, it may be imaginary dangers, as Tony has pointed out. It may be real dangers, but it's just safety. That kind of certainty brings with them a certain degree of safety. And so, but the problem with that, and I'll turn it back to you, is that you can't make decisions like the Civil Rights Act of 64 behind closed doors. There are important, controversial things that people disagree about. And the only way that we will come to a compromise on those things is if we fight each other and try to win. And the loser, just like Richard Russell in the Civil Rights Act of 64, having had the opportunity to fight, if that debate doesn't educate and persuade people, so maybe Russell says, you know what, I was wrong, you're right, I didn't realize that, okay, I lost my vote, okay, yeah. Or he just lost and he goes to the floor, as he did, and he says, I lost, we gave it our best shot, and now this is the law of the land. And so what the process does, all of that uncertainty, all of that fighting, giving the people you disagree with the most an opportunity to defeat you, reconciles them to the outcome when you defeat them. And that's how you get compromise. It doesn't come from sitting around Mitch McConnell's conference table. It can't come that way, and it never has, and it never will.
Well, yes, let's get a little bit to this issue of we've seen it in both chambers. In the House, members don't want to take votes on various amendments. They want legislation to be packaged up in certain ways that reduces the probability that they will suffer some sort of electoral threat. Same thing in the Senate. What I wonder is, in the background, do we have some certain long-term trends? Number one, the rise in the use of primaries really started to arrive in 1970. Every senator, every member of the House has to run through those. We know the voters there. They're, 1/5 of the eligible population. They can often be a little more intense or single issue. You got that going in the background. You also have another factor, as Francis Lee, political scientist, pointed out, this insecure majorities. No longer is it the Democrats. They can't just wake up and be sure that they will control the chamber. Instead, each party is kind of anxious that the next election is possibly going to either bring them into control or take control away. Are these factors in the background in some way making it rational for senators to kind of want to dodge debates and to have things kind of packaged up in a kind of low salient sort of way so that they can reduce their electoral risk? I mean, isn't this a rational response to some degree, or is it an over response? What do you think, Tony?
I think I'm sure many of them would view it as rational, but James made the point about safety, and I always think about this. It was I think 111th Congress member in the first one where we saw this just massive rise in nomination votes, right, as a percentage of the record. And every, at the time, Democratic senator got hit with the same attack ad pointing to their 97% support score with Barack Obama, right? Because there was nothing in there to differentiate their votes from other, the president and other politicians they might be tied to. So I don't know that the safety is really a thing, right? Not that I think those ads are particularly effective, but I don't think the other ads are particularly effective either. The rise in leadership being reticent to bring something to the floor that could split the party has always fascinated me. Within the legislative literature, we would refer to this as, or they'll often talk about this as being the party doesn't want to show that there's a split or a disagreement because they want to protect the party brand name. And for the life of me, I can't think of any definitive evidence that shows this actually helps anyone, right? I always come back to this. There's a great quote by Thomas Brackett Reed I use all the time where he's talking about bringing bills to the floor that are going to fail. And he says, a negative decision by a legislative body is as much value to the community as a law. And I do think the re-election focus that's driving everything is kind of depriving the community of seeing those votes, right? And I think James is spot on. You can't understand the Civil Rights Act of 64 without understanding the Civil Rights Act of 57 or 59, or even, the failures in the years before and after, a lot of which actually came out on the floor. So, to the extent that the primary is driving it, probably to some degree. I also think that just the at least perceived utility provided by messaging votes just led to that explosion, and now we're seeing a bit more of an overreaction to it.
Yeah, we had a couple of
quick,
senators with us because I would ask them, okay, I understand if you want to avoid voting on amendments and avoid, other ways to avoid tough votes. But we all know the rise of omnibus legislation means that if you're saying yes to something that has 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 pages, your opponent's going to be able to find something in there to misconstrue and run as a kind of, well, this senator voted for this one bad thing. They won't tell the voters that, this was part of a larger package, but that's going to happen regardless. And there's no way to hedge against that other than to just simply quit voting on all legislation, which I guess that would be taking this to the logical conclusion. James, you want in here?
I mean, we're not far from that. I mean, they do stuff, but I think when we say legislation for those who are joining us, the way I think about it is I don't give them credit for like highway bills. Like they don't get credit for that because Congress does that. They've always done it. They always will do it, right? There's some legislation that they just do, and people will say, well, they pass all this stuff. Yeah, they do. And, if you're passing stuff 99 to 1, okay, the stuff that we should be focused on to really see how dysfunctional the Senate is are the things that are the most controversial, the major bills, the landmark legislation, and look at how senators deal with those issues, because those issues ostensibly are the ones that are either the most important and consequential, or at least at the top of the public's agenda. And that will tell us a lot. You know, the primary thing, on one hand, it seems to make intuitive sense. It's almost so easy and intuitive that it just has to be true, right? And it may be. I'm not, and I think it certainly has an effect. But in terms of a cause, I mean, I could also argue, who is someone who is most likely to act? Get out of bed in the morning, put their feet on the ground, go to war on behalf of what they believe. A true believer, right? That's just what they do, right? That's on the left, the right, everybody. This is revolutionaries from the beginning of time. This is what you do. They don't hide behind conference room, closed doors to conference rooms. They want to be out there in the sunshine. They want to lose, because losing is a precursor to winning. Primaries, presumably, if they're driving everybody and you're worried about this, well, you know, if you're a primary challenger, you can still challenge people and say, why aren't you acting? Why aren't you doing this? Why haven't you done that? Why aren't you sitting up there like a potted plant? Mitch McConnell won his election against a Democrat, D. Edelson, by saying, where is he? He's not even here doing his job. There's no a conservative or a liberal could do the same thing and say, if you think that the border is so problematic, why don't you go down there and fix it? What are you doing? And I know they have some degree of that, but our consultants, as Tony has pointed out, are very well paid and they're very talented. And you could build a whole campaign around that kind of thing. So the liability of not acting isn't the problem in a primary. And that tells me a lot. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. But the other thing about insecure majorities, they've always been insecure. And the one time in our history when they weren't, the kind of regular order era, was also the period when our parties didn't mean anything. The Democratic Party was insecure. I mean, was secure, sure, but it was not in control. You had the conservative coalition. To refer to the Democratic Party of the 1950s in the same way as, say, the parties today, I think is not a good comparison. Because yes, it was secure, but it was secure because it had another party, Southern Democrats, who were completely different on a lot of, if not all, the major issues from a big chunk of the rest of the party, right? And so, you know, parties have always been insecure. I think it does help to explain, and it provides a very useful frame. And then the other thing I'll just point out, I just wanted to, as I think through these, you know, we have this, you could say, well, in the past when we were insecure, we have this nationalization of politics now. Well, our politics has also been nationalized in the past. We're an incredibly literate society early in American history. We had like 3 newspapers a day. I mean, the 19th century, people were into this stuff. Turnout and participation was sky high. Our issues were very nationalized as well. And the party itself, and I go back to what Tony said, you know, parties, their job, they have a job, right? We all have a job to do. A political party's job inside the Senate is to keep issues that their members disagree on off the agenda, so that they can win more often more of what they want over a longer period of time. Alexander Hamilton realized this when he pushed his allies in the Senate and House to form the Federalist Party in the first couple of Congresses in the 1790s. And ever since then, parties have tried to varying degrees of success to do that. What I find so remarkable today is that they are doing it very, very well at the precise moment when they are very, very divided. And then they're not winning more often more of what they want on the things they agree. So that's the puzzle that I can't quite work out in my mind.
Mm-hmm. I should mention for viewers out there that some years ago, James and Elaine K. Mark of Brookings Institution wrote a very interesting white paper on the Senate and primary elections, and showed it how senators will hedge the risk to them that they may face from a primary election through what they do.
Mitch McConnell gave his voting card, sorry to interrupt, to Rand Paul when he was primaried by a conservative challenger, and same Orrin Hatch just straight up said, Mike Lee, however you vote for the next 2 years, I'm going to vote just like you, because I don't want to have what happened to my former colleague Bennett happen to me.
So before we get to the prescriptions thing, I just want to dig into this incentives point a little bit deeper. We know that on kind of low salience legislation, stuff that's boring, technical, that has, that you can't rile voters up about, the Senate's often going to vote, overwhelmingly for it. They're going to move that bill along. High salience issues, I mean, you look what happened to James Langford as he tried to lead forth and forge something on immigration. Those are way tougher. Understandable, understandable. So, in terms of incentives, what do we make of the fact that we are soon to have a Senate that has 53, 54, maybe 55 GOP senators? And the party has made immigration a high salience brand issue. Do we think that the incentives are actually going to push them towards legislating on this issue? Or do we think that they're going to get tripped up in the process, that maybe the incentives and the electoral concerns will somehow make them not be able to get that over the line? Tony, your eyes are moving back and forth. You're cogitating
Yeah.
heavily.
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Great question. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is I'm probably less optimistic than everyone else on the Senate's ability to move less salient legislation. Uh, we have seen like kind of a drop, obviously, on the authorization process. We've seen them move pretty slowly on some other stuff as well. And I would also add too, right? Because I do think like some of the less salient stuff gets a bad rap. You know, when I look at like our list of landmark legislation, when we're doing Congress project, having students write about legislative histories, a good chunk of these were low salient when they were considered at the time and then ended up having massive implications after the fact. So I do think that stuff is kind of important. In terms of like, yeah, I think you were kind of getting at this, Kevin. This is probably where I'm going with it, is one of the quotes in legislative politics I often come back to is a Mayhew quote about punishing members for being on the, voters will often punish members for being on the wrong side of an issue, but not on a losing side of an issue. And I think we've kind of run with this, meaning you don't get punished for losing or for voting no and not passing things. Like I feel like every cycle, the media will write a new article about, well, this new party's in charge. Now they have to show America they know how to govern. I wish that was the case. I don't think that's the case, that Americans really hold them accountable for, passing or not passing legislation, especially if it, you think about something with immigration. Not passing an immigration bill, I think seems unlikely. Like you mostly associate immigration bills with being a slightly more liberal bill. So I could see that being not a major issue that actually goes through.
James, what do you think? Do you think
former Senator Richard Shelby once told me that there's,
Is the party going to feel the pressure when you've made immigration, or pick another topic that they've made part of the modern GOP brand? Are they going to? Does that kind of create an incentive structure where in the Senate, senators are going to get out there and fight this out and do the amendments and bargain it through? And if that means Democrats decide to filibuster it, that they're just going to stick with it? I mean, how do you think this could play out?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's. Let me put it this way. First, I mean, Richard Shelby once told me, the former senator from Alabama, you never get. He's like, the best vote is and I would always go, no vote. So I mean, I think that's an insightful point Tony made. I'd also say, when I say you don't get credit for low salience issues, what I mean is, what we're interested in is trying to get at what's wrong. And the place where you're going to find what's wrong is going to be when Congress is dealing with issues that they can't figure out how to work on, right? Issues that divide the two parties or regions, issues that are really hard, because that's actually the job. And, in Congress, we negotiate the non-negotiable. If it wasn't non-negotiable, we wouldn't have a Congress. We wouldn't need one, right? We don't talk about the sun rises in the east every day. Why? Because every now and then I'll say the West, just to see if anybody's paying attention. But, we don't talk about that in Congress. Why? Because it's not non-negotiable. We have these places because we don't have rulers to tell us what the right answer is. We have to figure that out ourselves because we govern ourselves, and therefore we need a place to go, or our representatives, to do that. Now, the question is, why isn't the Senate? I don't think the Senate will. Maybe I will be proven wrong. I hope so. Why won't they do big things? And the answer, I think, is counterintuitive, but it does help, I think, explain things a lot better than say I mean, it's related to primaries. It's related to all these other things going around. And to me, that is that the way they think that you need to be successful in politics, or the way that senators and us and the chattering classes and the observers and the media and everybody, the way that we think about politics and how to be successful in the Senate on, say, bills like immigration, that way is actually why nothing happens. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to 2007, immigration bill. That was the last serious push, I would say, with somewhat of an open process. You had majorities in both parties. You had the president of the United States supporting comprehensive immigration reform. At the time, I worked for Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions was not a supporter of comprehensive immigration reform, if you didn't know. And he was vastly outnumbered. He was on the Judiciary Committee, and he was in the Senate, but he was vastly outnumbered. The Senate voted to get on the bill, to begin debate. The vote was in the high 70s, both party leaders. It was down the line. I mean, it was done. And I asked the senator one time, and I don't think he would mind me sharing this. I was like, how are we going to prevail? If you won't like this policy, how is this going to work? Well, the first thing that I learned watching this is that he didn't try to stop it in the Judiciary Committee. He was outnumbered. So why would he? So let's go to the floor. It's a different venue. That venue is also better because it's more public. And Sessions made a bet that turned out to be true, that the American people didn't like the bill. It could have been wrong, but he made the bet. And he said, I need to create a process over the next 2 weeks. It was a 2-week period that can attract a lot of attention, bring more people into the debate so that they can make their feelings known, so that their representatives and senators will have a harder time doing something that their voters don't want them to do. And he used amendments to do it. He forced votes on things, and he picked a fight, but he picked a fight with his own party. The polarized conservative Southern senator picked a fight with his own party. Why? That's a lot more interesting than a fight with the Democrats. That gets people to turn on the TV and listen to the radio on the way home. They're like, well, that's interesting. Why is one Republican in this polarized era disagreeing and arguing against another one? That's weird, right? And then all of a sudden they come in, and as they come in, the phone line shut down. The phone line, and then the senators are like, what's the mail doing? And they're like, oh, everybody's opposed. And this perception of reality, it takes hold that if I vote for this bill that America hates, they were mailing bricks. That's expensive. I've never mailed a brick. Have you? I mean, I don't, maybe you get a book rate. I don't know, but it's a brick has got, I mean, I mailed a book the other day and that was expensive. They were mailing bricks to the Senate, bricks to build a wall. This is way before Donald Trump, from all across the country. After that, in that bill, when they went to end debate on it, after 2 weeks of an open process where amendments went back and forth, and it wasn't just Sessions, like Baucus and his Real ID, or Lindsey Graham had a Real ID amendment that turned out to be pivotal, and a little bit of strategic voting in there. But 3 senators, Sessions, Dement, and Vitter, and then maybe it was an assist from Coburn, turned over 30 votes in 2 weeks. It went from high 70s to they couldn't even crack 40s. If you looked at the C-SPAN video footage, McConnell, who voted to get on the bill and who is an ardent supporter of comprehensive immigration reform, stormed off the floor. He was furious. I mean, it's obvious when you watch the video. He was furious. That moment was when the Senate, if you had to pick one moment, started to go, and we could say, well, it's Sessions. No, it's not Sessions' fault. The reaction to Sessions' effort was, let's not let that happen again on anything. People who opposed bills said that's a winning template. People who wanted to pass bills said, we can't let anything like that happen again. No more amendments, because if you have amendments, then that's the hook to get the media involved, and that's the activist, and then all these other things. And we're essentially doing what presidents do when they pressure Congress, which is using the public. And that was what happened. And then this process shut down. And now we think the way we can pass really controversial things that voters care about is to make sure that they don't know until it's done. And it's like, that's what a factory does. We're not building them a car that they ordered, and we have the specifications, we put it all together and we give it to them. That's a factory. What we're doing is deciding what the car is going to look like in the first place. We're designing the blueprint. We're coming up with it. We're arguing. And then we're going to also build it by passing that legislation and then send it back to them. It's a different kind of process. It's a deliberative process where no one's in charge. And the people, ultimately, you can't insulate them because they are the force that ultimately, just like in the Civil Rights Act of 64, Dr. King got this with his civil rights movement and the nonviolent movement. You need leverage to change the status quo. That leverage can only come from one place, outside of Congress. The status quo is the status quo for a reason. You don't come in and be like, let's change everything. And then the committee chairs can be like, yeah, because they're the ones who made it out in the first place. And the leaders are the ones. And the status quo can only be changed by bringing more people into the debate, And the only way you can do that is by creating controversy and conflict, because that's interesting. And that is precisely why the Senate is really boring today.
I mean, flashbacks of the famous political scientist E. E. Schatzsnyder talking about widening the loop and tightening the loop of around a debate of a legislative issue. All right, we are a little bit past 9:30, and I do want to get audience questions in shortly, but let me pivot to what can be done to make the Senate a place where senators feel better, feel more encouraged to be able to amend, uh, to openly debate difficult issues, to kind of embrace the sort of messiness of working through, serving as proxies for pluralism, to try to create the unum out of the pluribus. Tony, I want to start with you. You mentioned the complexity of process, and that reminded me that one of the anecdotes in the new book about Mitch McConnell, Price of Power by Michael Tackett, is an instance where McConnell, remarkably, the House had passed legislation on a topic, the Senate had passed legislation on a topic. All they had to do is appoint conferees and let the process play out. As described in the book, there were 3 separate votes that had to be called before the Senate conferees were appointed. And McConnell recognized that and used it to stop it. So the conferees were never appointed. You never had the conference committee, and the legislation was never reconciled. And it was a point of pride for him that he had figured it out and been able to do that. Is the process part of the problem? I mean, is there too many opportunities for the works to be gummed up? I mean, the average American, if they were listening to this, would probably be like, why would it take 3 votes to appoint somebody to be on a committee whose only job is to negotiate?
Yeah,
What do you think, Tony?
it's a great question. I do think they got rid of that specific ability in the 113th. Right,
Yeah,
with the
McConnell did.
motion. Yeah, McConnell did. Yeah. Yeah, to the degree I do think it is part of the problem. Although I'll say that with a few caveats. I would say even more broadly that at a minimum, it's real dumb. All right, just the way the Senate is designed I mean, it's not designed, and that's kind of the issue, is we're operating under a bunch of rules and precedents that were not necessarily apply or meant to apply to the chamber today, right? Or meant to apply in the long term. It wasn't like anybody sat down and thought, this is a thing we really want, right? I always come back to that Elizabeth Warren, yes, we can, getting called to order under that precedent, right? Stemming from a rule that was created in the wake of John McLaurin getting punched in the face by Tillman, right? After he got like hammered on moonshine, right? And the fact that that rule or that precedent still existed for like 100 years just seems silly, I guess would be the way I would put it. But yeah, irrespective of the debate over the filibuster, I do think there are a lot of redundant motions in both chambers from a process standpoint that could be simplified, that would help the general public out. All right. Again, 3 different abilities of being able to filibuster a motion to proceed and the bill itself. Again, I think there's ways to simplify that would make it easier for the public to follow what their legislative body is doing. You hear members talk all the time about transparency, but then you look at how the rules are designed and you ask yourself, is this transparent for anybody trying to follow this? Right? I was talking to a House panel about this and trying to explain how frustrating it is to talk to people and be like, no, the first vote here is going to be a motion to order the previous question motion on this martial law rule, followed by the vote on the martial law rule itself, followed by a motion to order the previous question motion on the rule, followed by a vote on the rule, followed by any amendments. Then you're actually going to get the vote on the bill or the debate on the bill. All right. So I think we don't get transparency when you're hiding behind rules and process. as much as we're hiding behind rules and process. So yeah, I do think it is a problem. I also kind of go back and forth when we think about obstruction in the Senate. I've always had a problem with the way the literature characterizes the filibuster, and the media will talk about it as if it's a weapon instead of like a procedural environment. I think it fosters a lot of odd compromises behind the scenes. And while we're trained to think that the bipartisan compromise always has like positive policy implications, you know, since we've been doing this legislative history project, we're finding oftentimes it doesn't.
Jim Crow segregation
not seeing it. Was that
sustained private behind closed doors bipartisan compromise?
Yeah,
with the bright light of sunshine, ultimately.
Or even sometimes like the floor amendment that they give very little time to discuss and think about, right? As much as we will often complain about interest groups and the partisan impact of them, they'll usually think about what the implications of a bill or policy is a lot more than the bipartisan floor amendment that gets tacked on at the end of a longer debate. But yeah, so I go both ways, but I do think simplifying would be helpful. James.
As a quick technical follow-up, Tony, I once heard a very astute observer of the Senate say that the present day blight of the chamber is quorum calls, endless quorum calls. Help listeners understand what that criticism is and what's that mean. What is a quorum call? And
well, I mean, turn on C-SPAN at any given point. It is ratings, like an absolute ratings killer, right? Of just trying to get members to the floor for somebody basically to take the floor. But yeah, James.
I mean, yeah, I'm going to disagree with Tony. It's the one time I'm ever going to disagree with Tony.
Oh, no, I had in my notes that James is going to disagree on this point.
So. I think maybe this is intentional. A quorum call, basically, the Senate can't do nothing. That's terrible grammar, but it is what it is. It can't. It has to do something. And the precedents and the rules state very explicitly when no one's speaking, they got to vote, period, full stop. The reason why we're always in a quorum call is that there are two times when the chair can't put a vote. That is when someone's speaking, hence the filibuster, which is just the opportunity to speak. It's not a filibuster. It's not a veto, even though it may operate like one in practice, but that's on us, not the rule. So, or during a quorum call. And so leaders, if you think about it, if you're a leader, you have no power and you're expected to keep everything under control and have all the answers. So what's job number one? Stop anything from happening that you don't first know about. So how do you do that? And with a rule that says that you have to vote when no one's doing anything. Well, you do that by telling people to suggest the absence of a quorum when they're done talking. And so I'm down the floor, I'm like, oh, and I'm done. And I suggest the absence of a quorum. Technically, under the rules of the House and Senate, the Constitution requires you have a quorum to do business, right? So the quorum call, the clerk will go, and I'm getting my mind like, when I was there, it was Alexander. And then 20 minutes later, Akaka. Well, no, K, Akaka, then Alex, whatever. My alphabet may be a little rusty, but you get the idea. And they would go very slow, and they would call very slow. They might get to like dement. And then like Mike Lee would show up and say, I ask unanimous consent that the call to quorum be waived or vitiated. At which point, boom, it's done. If they get to the bottom, they go, whoa, no one's here. We just called the roll and only two people responded. Then they ring the bells. Everybody comes like in West Wing and the TV show. And then they all say present. And if there's enough there, then they can keep doing business. If not, they have to adjourn. But that's not the purpose of suggesting the absence of a quorum. The purpose of suggesting the absence of a quorum is to shut the floor down so that the chair doesn't have to call the question. Because they can't, otherwise they have to say, I ask unanimous consent that we not vote on this until we're ready. At which point somebody's going to object because they can, right? And so I think that though illustrates the purpose of the rules. And I want to push back against this motion to proceed in conference stuff. Say the three of us are together, we're all equals, or say, and we get to make a decision. And no one's in charge, no one gets to make that decision. We have to agree to make that decision, hence the absence of rulers. Well, we first have to decide what are we going to prioritize, right? Maybe Kevin wants to talk about post office stuff. And Tony and I are like, no one wants to talk about the post office, Kevin. But thankfully, Kevin's going to persuade us it isn't, but we have to have a debate over it. And then I'm like, whoa, no, I think we should talk about fly fishing. And then Tony's like, let's talk about Dire Straits because it's the best rock band ever, right? And then we have three different people representing millions of people who have their own concerns as well from different parts of the country. And they're saying the most important issue right now is not, price supports for peanuts. Are you crazy? It's what's happening out in California with the wildfires. I think we should do that. And so you have to have a mechanism to make that decision because equals make that decision. We just assume that that decision's already been made, and it's any kind of effort to do otherwise is not going to work. That's the motion to proceed. It is equals coming together, in theory at least, to make a decision as to what to prioritize. Now, it doesn't operate that way, but if we get rid of it, we're basically saying, okay, we're going to let one person prioritize everything, and we're going to move the process for pressuring that person from a public venue where the people can play, which is they're ultimately in charge, to a private one where they have no clue what's going on and people can say whatever they want. Similarly, with conference, the House passes a bill, the Senate has to pass it to agree, and then the president can sign, but they have to agree. So they have to have some mechanism to agree. They send it back over to the Senate. The Senate says, we don't agree with that. That's one distinct question, right? So you have to say, I don't agree. The next question is, well, what do you do now? Do we want to change it and send it back? Or do we want to ask them, can we go meet and talk about this? And we can figure this out, right? Right? That's the second distinct question. And then if they decide, let's not send it back, let's figure this out, let's talk about it. Then they need a third distinct question. Well, are we all going to go over there? And somebody in the back's like, I don't want to go. I got plans. I got to go to dinner. I don't want to go over there. Why don't you two go? Is everybody okay with that? Yeah, that's the third distinct question. Those are the three steps to go to conference. What McConnell did when he obstructed was to use those to try to achieve his policy goals, to get a little bit of leverage. Right? Maybe he was trying to get them to change something in the bill. Maybe he wanted to kill it outright. I don't know. When he's leader and he gets rid of that, he doesn't get rid of those three steps. He collapses them into one. That's all he does. Now, it may be the right decision. There is no one right set of rules. There's no one right way to do Congress. And the last thing I'll say on this is we need to rethink how we think about the rules. The rules aren't constraints. They're not like your parents giving you a curfew, and if you don't listen to them, there are consequences. Because senators make the rules. They're the ones who make their own rules. They cannot, by definition, constrain them. Tom Coburn taught me when I was in the Senate the right way to think about the rules, I think. And that is as leverage, because the Senate doesn't follow its rules. They do everything at negotiations, unanimous consent, and they create new rules. Question is, how do you get leverage in those negotiations and get, especially when they're all private, because the people can't play? Well, you threaten to do something public using the rules. You look at the rule book, and you're like, oh, well, I want to have this thing happen on Tuesday. They're like, no, we're not going to do that. And you're like, oh, well, I have a rule here that says I can make it happen on Saturday. Do you want to be here on Saturday? Because if you don't, then let's do it on Tuesday. But if you do, I'm doing it on Saturday. So let's work together and we'll figure this out. And then you start talking, and then no one gets everything they want. And then there's a compromise. That way of thinking about the rules is vital. And that's how senators throughout history have thought about them up until recently. Now they're constraints. They're like handcuffs. They're like, oh, I wish we could do this. We need to change the rules. They're not using what they have already. And I used to think the only thing we need are like 2 or 3 senators to use the rules, and then it'd be fine. And that, I think, still holds. But maybe a new approach, because senators are so far from that. They are so far from, like, we don't have the muscle memory anymore, right? We don't know. What I'm saying right now is crazy. If I was in the United States Senate, they would think that I'm basically saying, birds have arms and they're unstoppable, right? That's how crazy this sounds. Right? It's so alien to how they see the world. So if you come in like that, you're never going to get anywhere. So maybe we should start, and this is a new thing for me, and I've been kind of encouraged by what I'm seeing right now with like Mike Lee and the effort to use the leadership election as leverage to kind of change process. And that is, instead of kind of just ignoring leadership, which is what I would say, which is what senators did historically, and just being a senator, right? You don't need them. Instead of doing that, because that's too radical, why don't you try to get leadership to help you decentralize the institution? And that seems counterintuitive at first. And then, why would they? Well, because you make them promise in exchange for supporting them. And then when they violate that promise, you cry, foul, and then you attack them in the press, stuff like that. I don't know. But ultimately, I think leaders can be a force for good and bad in this situation in terms of process. And I think if you can get a leader who says, I can only be leader if I do a Mike Mansfield and give every senator the opportunity to be a senator, it's a lot easier in this environment with this group of senators to ultimately succeed and get the institution back to a semblance of what it once looked like.
Well, all right. I've got some audience questions coming in. I also should mention that when I talked about long-term trends, the rise of primaries, insecure majorities is possibly playing into the incentive structure, I omitted the fact that over the course of the last 50 years, we have seen the party leader become a major fundraiser. So, for example, in the most recent round of elections, if I heard him correctly, Mr. McConnell and his super PAC raised something like $425 million that they put into the election. And that is no doubt something that can affect the perceived incentives that a senator may have. All right, first question from the audience out there. Let me read it to you. One of the panelists made the comment that the Senate should deliberate and engage in a dynamic process where no one is in charge. Doesn't the ad hoc nature of the Senate procedure prevent this? Don't the rules and precedents essentially require a single person, the majority leader, to be in charge of the debate and provide structure because the rules themselves don't provide that structure? You want to try that one, James? And we'll move to the next
the rules
one.
don't require anybody to have
that question.
it.
I immediately thought that is James Wallner's wheelhouse. So, yeah.
The rules give every senator the ability to move to proceed to a bill. The rules give every senator the ability to speak. The rules give every senator the same right to offer amendments and make motions. What makes the majority leader able to do that more often, and why senators defer to the majority leader, is because there's a precedent that says that if two senators rise at the same time to speak under Rule 19, then they have to, the majority leader and then the minority leader are going to be recognized first. But that's only if they both rise at the precise same time. And that's just because Cactus Jack Nance Garner, Roosevelt's vice president, wanted to make his job easier. He's like, you know what, from now on, you all are shouting, I'm just going to recognize the leader over there. That preferential recognition gives the leader the ability to be the first one to make motions. But but McConnell's not always on the floor, right? I mean, so then we have to ask, well, how has it gotten to where we are today? It's because senators get a benefit from this. They defer to their floor leaders, whose job ostensibly is to make their life easier in the past by facilitating their participation in the process, today by blocking it, right? But they defer to those leaders. That is a judgment call on their part. The rules are not the problem. The problem are the senators and how they use the rules. The last thing I'll say is there was an open letter in the Washington Post, I think it was the Post, like several years ago. It was all these 70-something former senators. And they wrote this letter like, the Senate it's just terrible. That's why we left. I'm like, well, okay. And then they're like, it's not the committee's fault. It's not the leader's fault. It's not the senator's fault. And I'm reading, I'm like, who is left? Is this Scooby-Doo? Is somebody going to jump out and like, oh, it's all Earl down the street? No, there's no one left inside the Senate. The Senate is broken, as I've said in the past, because senators are breaking it. And they all have the same power to stop and start fixing it.
Yeah, I wanted to just agree with James on that point. There's a bunch I would have disagreed, but I know we got to get the question.
Stop there,
but like the leadership point, I always try and make that caveat up front when I'm talking to students, is the first thing you'll hear members complain about is if you bring them into a classroom is always going to be their own party's leadership, followed by the other chamber, followed by maybe the other party, but it's usually party leadership first. And you don't want to get fooled. People all complain about leadership, but leadership operates the way they are because of the member. Don't let the member get off the hook by saying, oh, I disagreed, but leadership did this. Like, you have the ability to stop leadership from doing that, especially in the Senate.
Yeah, so I should mention that the present majority leader, Chuck Schumer of New York, when the Senate was in session, of the last 100 votes that were held under Mr. Schumer, 81 were devoted to nominations. Not surprising. That's a rational calculation on his behalf and on the party's behalf. In a run-up to election, why vote on bills when instead you could try to vote on the people that your president put up and put them in the executive branch? Seems a whole lot safer as a strategy. All right,
and Kevin, I had last 2 seconds. I think you can do it. It's going to sound crazy, but you can. I've argued in the past that you can amend a nominee. Now, if you amend a nominee, whether or not you can do it or not, if you start trying to do it, I guarantee you that 81% is going to go down to zero. If a nomination becomes a vehicle for a legislative amendment, they'll disappear overnight, just like amendments have disappeared. And that, I think, speaks to the real problem.
That would do it. All right, another question coming in. Perhaps hearing some of the more dour takes on the state of the higher chamber. One audience member asked, what do you think of abolishing the Senate and having a unicameral legislature? Tony Madonna, thoughts there?
I don't know that I'm fully on board yet with just burning it down, but it does kind of fit with my simplification thesis. And I do think, like, when you think about the filibuster, one of the issues I've often had with it, is you'll debate this with people that have worked in the Senate for a long time, and they'll always compare the Senate to the Senate historically, or maybe to the House, right? When you look at it from a comparative standpoint, the amount of transaction costs in the US lawmaking process, even before you think about, the 60th most senator having impact, is pretty substantial. And I think it makes it difficult for the public, or certainly harder for the public, to trace or assign accountability for policies, right? Because, you have the court system, you have the president, you have state governments, you have the committee system, you have a bicameral legislature, and then you're working in the filibuster. And again, it makes it difficult to track, like, who's to blame for this specific policy included in this bill. And some of that is on leadership, right? And some of that is on the omnibus process and all that. But I think the way, the heavy transaction cost system is incentivized makes it exceptionally difficult to follow lawmaking, even before we get into the weird rules and all that. So short answer, no one blowing it up right now, but I think.
And speaking of speaking of the costs involved, obviously it involved amending the U.S. Constitution, which is a rather laborious process, and there would be many people who would be firmly against that sort of thing, not least the senators themselves. James Wallner, question come in for you. The filibuster. Would you imagine under the current or incoming GOP majority, there would be any move to further curtail the use of the filibuster so that under unified government, it would be easier for Mr. Trump and the party to act?
Yeah, I don't see it right now, in part because you have some conservatives like Mike Lee, who are institutionalists as well, and I think have some concerns about that stuff. I don't want to speak for him, but you have members like that. And you also have the fact that you have to find an issue that divides the two parties right down the middle and unifies both of them equally, and then also mobilizes enough pressure on the outside to push them to do something like that. And those issues they're not that many of them, right? But I will say, and I am a firm, and not just because I love the filibuster, I just think the rules matter. Both parties think about the rules the same way. They think of it as a means to an end. And when the rules become a means to an end, the end is going to justify anything you need to do to get it, which is why they can say, well, we got to get the nuclear option. It's tyranny if the Democrats do it. But then when we have, we can put somebody in the Supreme Court, well, we need to do it. Look at, they're doing this other thing. It's always the end. That kind of thinking, that production process thinking, is what is destroying the Senate. It's what's destroying Congress, and it's destroying American self-government. That's the problem at the end of the day. Because look, we have goals. Of course we have goals. Everybody is trying to do something. But when you think about it as a process where you are producing an end, you begin to rationalize the things you do to get to that end. When you do that, the rules have no meaning. And when the rules lose all meaning, we lose these goalposts of reliability, these islands of predictability, things you absolutely have to have as leverage to participate in the process, but also as a reason to compromise and not push all the way. Why? I know I'm going to lose now. I don't want to, but I know if I play my cards right under the same set of rules next month, I might have a shot at doing this again. So I'm going to take 60% or 40%, and then I'm going to come back. The very notion of American self-government is impossible with a means justify, or the ends justify the means mentality. That's Karl Marx. I mean, at the end of the day, and I hate to, kind of end this on a hyperbolic note, but we're all Marxists right now. We are basically how we think and understand politics on the right and the left is that anything is justified as long as it gets you what you say needs to happen. Well, what does that do? That makes you a ruler, and it says everybody else is your subject because they disagree with you. They don't have a say. And last time I checked in America, we don't have rulers, right? I mean, presumably we all still agree with that. Yeah. And our system is set up in such a way to make it impossible for anybody to rule America. And that's why we shouldn't get rid of the Senate. We got two Congresses. Why? Because we needed to strengthen the federal government. But we don't want to give it to just then 218 people can rule us. So we want to make it really, really hard for any one group to get that power. If you get rid of the Senate, you get rid of the reason why we're able to empower the national government. The Constitution didn't just limit government. It also empowered it. And so those are two sides of the same coin. And we need the Senate. We need the veto. We need bicameralism. We need checks and balances. Without checks and balances, this does not work.
It's untrammeled majoritarianism. Tony, in quickly before we have to end the program.
Yeah, I would just add to like as I agreed with most of that. The exception being, I do think there are some rules that we can sit down and have a discussion and think, what is the intent of this? Is this useful? Right? I think I pitched James on this. If you go to the Confederation Congresses under the Articles, there were a number of just comically inept rules that were in place. And I don't think it's necessarily, a Marxist position to say, hey, Elbridge Gerry offering a motion to divide on every 3 words in a question, right? Which he did, and he would force votes on these like 3 word sections, right? Process needs to be altered or amended. But yeah, this has been super interesting. I really appreciate it, James and Kevin. Yeah, it's like phenomenal therapy for me when I think about Congress, is being able to come in here and talk about it. And yeah.
We are out of time, which is unfortunate because there are many other questions. One question was in the queue was about nominations and reducing the amount of them. Previously, there has been deals cut to reduce the number of votes that have to be taken. Would that be something to do again? But we don't have time for that now. So next week, parties come to DC and they will be hashing out who gets to be the leader in the Senate and perhaps also deals on how they want the chamber to operate. So it's going to be very interesting to watch. So let me say thank you, Professor Tony Madonna. Thank you, Dr. James Wallner, for sharing your expertise with us. And thanks to all of you in the audience who joined us for the conversation. Like I said, there's so much more to be said about that. And if you want to continue the discussion, please feel free to reach out to me on the Twitter X platform and tag me and put your questions there. And I'll hop in as soon as I can. And if either the two experts who are with me want to get into that conversation, they are certainly invited. So once again, thanks to the speakers, thanks to the audience, and have a great day.